thank Rusty Willett, who hopefully will join us before this is all over, because it was at his urging that the East Sangerville Grange partner with the Thompson Free Library for this. A lot of people think that the reason that we study history is so that we don't keep making the same mistakes. I would prefer to say that it helps us to put a context on where we are now and where we're going to go in the future. I like to put a positive spin on what history is all about. So I'm looking forward to Liam's presentation because I think he's going to help us to understand how we got to be where we are today and what our role was in this, as the state of Maine in the making of our country, and help us to appreciate our identity as Mainers and the state of Maine. So I'm delighted for this opportunity. So Liam, I'm going to thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Diane and Greta. I really appreciate the opportunity to come speak with you. I'm going to try to share my screen, which hopefully will go smoothly. And I think if you opt for the gallery view option, you can sort of see the screen I'm sharing, but also see a couple of faces, which I think is the most humane way to try to manage Zoom these days. And you know, what I want to share with you tonight is some of the research that I've done over the last couple of years to understand the Maine statehood era. And I kind of start with a confession, because when I moved to Maine in 1997, I had trained in graduate school in Philadelphia as a anti-New England early American historian, right? Like the purpose of my dissertation was to displace New England from the center of our thinking about early American history. But then, of course, I got a job in New England, and so I spent the last 20 plus years trying to make up for that deficiency. And maybe as a result of that guilt or the penance that I had to pay for my lack of attention to New England in my graduate training, I have sort of poured myself into thinking about the statehood era and the related but slightly different question of how should we commemorate a bicentennial? So I have been doing a fair bit of this. I actually organized the first meeting of people to talk about how should we commemorate the bicentennial back in June of 2016. So it's been quite a long time. And one of the things I hope we're able to do tonight is not just have me talk the entire time. And in particular, I think if I give just a straight lecture and talk for 45 minutes, by the time we get to the end, everyone's so exhausted or has forgot what they were curious about earlier, it's kind of hard to get back to. So I would really like it if people would unmute themselves and just speak up and ask a question. And the talk that I have is organized around 4 past-present connections, 4 aspects of the statehood era that I think we can still recognize in contemporary Maine society and culture today. So those are kind of natural stopping points. So I'll typically stop and ask for questions. And then if those of you who are kind of familiar operating in the strange Zoom universe, you also know there's kind of a handy chat feature. So you can click on that chat button and type in a question. And so depending, whatever you're more comfortable with, either are fine from my point of view. If you want to just unmute and ask a question, that would be great. I encourage you to do it. I have at least one former student in the audience, Derek. So Derek, I'm hoping you'll set a good model and ask a question at some point to shut me up and change where we're focusing our energy. But then also you can compose a question on the chat. And I think Greta or Diane are going to keep an eye on that and ask questions as they come in. So what can we learn from the bicentennial, right? This is a sort of neat opportunity for me as an early American historian who really specializes in the broad revolutionary era, because the bicentennial has made people a little bit curious about a time period that is far away from us, right? I don't get a whole lot of requests to speak about early American history, except in this bicentennial era, right? So our consciousness is kind of triggered. We're curious about it. And what I have for my first slide is what I think most of us would agree is the most recognizable symbol of the bicentennial. And this is the commemorative license plate that was issued by the state, which I proudly have on the front bumper of my car, and I suspect several of you do as well. And that sort of branding, if you will, is a significant part of commemoration, right? And in fact, that license plate poses the question for us of the relationship between 1820 and 2020. But what is it that we do share? I mean, maybe things are more different in 2020 than we are connected to 1820. So that's really the puzzle that I want to explore with you tonight, to talk about 4 connections between the past and present, 4 ways that 1820 and 2020 are linked. But what is really most interesting to me about history, and I think this is really fundamental to historical curiosity, is that some things do persist and we can see these strong connections, but at the very same time, really important things change. And kind of struggling to clarify for ourselves what persists and what changes, that to me is really an exciting part of studying early American history. That I'll be talking about some aspects of the statehood era, and I think we will all say to ourselves, boy, that is exactly like 2020. But it is also the case that there are so many things that are different. And so that to me is sort of the joy and excitement of doing history, is playing with that relationship between change and also continuity, and trying to understand that tension and relationship in ways that make even early American history meaningful to us in the present. And for me, that is really the goal of commemoration, is not to memorize a bunch of facts about the past and not to simply celebrate the past, but to use reflection about a distant period from us to help us better understand our own moment. I think it really does provide us with tools to broaden our point of view beyond the personal and the individual, to think a little bit more broadly about what do we share. And, as we go into the final week of the election, I think it's clear that we do need to recognize what we share in a civic sense. And history has an important role to play in that. And so in that sense, I do think the bicentennial of Maine statehood has arrived on our doorstep at a fortunate time for all of us, to try to breathe a little bit deeply, think a little bit more broadly, and reflect on what we share in a long, persistent legacy of the statehood era. So I want to start with, the most basic facts of statehood, and that is that Maine became the 23rd US state on March 15th, 1820. So we have a clear official birthday for the state of Maine. And quite tragically, that bicentennial birthday came, I think, literally 48 hours as we really began to grapple with the dire consequences of COVID. So this has certainly thrown the bicentennial year into a lot of turmoil. And, you know, there are some silver linings to that. I think we, for the most part, have discovered that Zoom allows us to communicate more easily at a greater distance than we ever could have thought. And it does also mean that there are a number of the major state bicentennial commemorative events are going to get pushed to March 1821. My secret hope is that they will allow me to keep my bicentennial license plate on the front of my car for another year, even though I'm told I really should replace it with my dull old rear license plate, but we'll see how that plays out. This is one of two maps I'm going to be sharing by a extraordinary Maine cartographer and land surveyor named Moses Greenleaf. And I'm hoping he might be familiar to some of you in the audience because he's from the Williamsburg, Brownville area. And so with a little bit of luck, maybe someone will be able to tell me a little bit more about Moses Greenleaf, and that can be part of our discussion a little bit later. And I do think of this as the first official map of the state of Maine, done in 1820, roughly looking like how we think about the state of Maine today. I have been told it's not an official map and I shouldn't describe it that way, but that is still how I think about it. Maybe it didn't have the imprimatur of the state legislature, but that I think is a good starting place for us in thinking about Maine as it became a state in 1820. Now, the first of the past-present connections that I want to talk about is the single most famous aspect of Maine statehood. And I think this is the one that most people are generally familiar with, but it is also an aspect of Maine statehood that is confusing. And I have to say, I didn't really understand the Maine, Missouri crisis accurately until the bicentennial led me to really dig into it and try to understand it in a more complete manner. So just about every single textbook in the United States, whether for high school or college and possibly for middle schools as well, has some version of the map that we're looking at here. And as you can see, it's titled The Missouri Compromise with the years 1820, 1821. And it is trying to depict that relationship between the entrance of Maine as a free state in 1820 with the admission of Missouri as a slave state in 1821. And not only do the two states come in as sort of a linked package, but part of the complicated congressional resolution of this conflict over slavery is the red line we see depicted on the map here, the 3630 line. And that agreed that although Missouri would come in with slavery as a legal institution, other future states north of that line would not be permitted to do so. Now, there are a number of things that are confusing about this. And one thing to stress is that this reflects an incredible moment of crisis in the national politics of the United States. The US Congress literally ground to a halt in 1819 and 1820 as it struggled to resolve the crisis over whether or not the national government would permit slavery to expand to parts of the Louisiana Territory that were coming in, beginning with Missouri and in its wake. Now, this is a bit of a puzzle, right? Because Maine does not have slavery as a legal institution, and there are not a large number of people of African descent living in Maine in this period. Yet, because of the significance of slavery to US history, it becomes an inescapable issue in the national politics of the day. And the major political parties did not really want this to happen. They tried not to make slavery a political issue because that was really a problem if you were trying to build a national constituency in order to succeed at a national level in US politics of this era. So slavery forces its way onto the political agenda in a somewhat surprising way. A New York congressman initiated a bill in the US House of Representatives in February of 1819 after Missouri has applied to become a state. And that bill outlaws Missouri's admission if slavery will be legal there. And that wins in the US House of Representatives, but the US Senate rejects that proposal. And so that is really the deadlock between the House and the Senate. Jump ahead to December of 1819, Congress has not been able to resolve this impasse, and Maine's petition to become a state arrives in Washington, D.C., and gets caught up in this tremendous controversy. And right away, we have letters from US congressmen back to their political allies in Maine warning that this is going to be a huge problem and is going to derail Maine's statehood. And one of them in particular, a guy named Mark Langdon Hill, who's from Phippsburg, writes back to William King, the most prominent Maine politician who's in favor of Maine statehood, and says he hopes that people in Maine will, quote, say nothing opposed to the wishes of the Southern people. And he adds a PS to his letter, I hope the people of Maine will remain still on the slave question. Now, this package that puts Maine and Missouri together is engineered by the Speaker of the House of Representatives named Henry Clay. And Henry Clay is from the state of Kentucky, so just to the west of Missouri. And it has a very similar sort of pro-slavery stand as a upper South Western state. And so Clay helps to engineer a complicated legislative package to resolve the crisis and hopefully move forward. So a key vote comes before the House of Rep. Well, let me stop there for a minute and see if there are any questions at this point. Any comment about this image? Anybody want to ask a question before I move into even more details about the political controversy? Derek, go for it.
So this kind of coincides at this point with an era that, like the era of good feelings.
Yeah.
Doesn't that seem a little counterintuitive though, given that we're kind of negotiating over the future of slavery that will last for the next 40 plus years. It just seems weird that this compromise sort of extends this good feeling, this willingness to work across the aisle when we're talking about the issue of slavery.
So it's a really interesting question, and that is a very famous phrase to describe the sort of national politics of this era. But I don't know that it's really a very accurate phrase. And part of what has happened by the 18 teens is that national parties have really lost their sense of direction. Like we had a big success with Jefferson's election and then a series of Jeffersonian presidential candidates. But that party identity has begun to weaken. And I think that's part of how slavery is able to push its way onto the agenda. that when the parties operated more effectively, one of their goals was to exclude and prevent public discussion of slavery. But now you're at a position where that Jeffersonian political party, often called the Democratic Republican Party, has splintered into a number of different groups. And you have some Federalists, a more conservative party kind of associated with George Washington and John Adams. They've really had no success at the national level since Jefferson was elected in 1800. But they retain pockets of strength elsewhere, especially in New England. And I'll talk about Federalists more in a little bit later. And so I think it's kind of the collapse of partisanship and really disciplined party organization that allows this explosive question to get out. And I'll share a quote from a Portland newspaper from January 1820 that I think does a nice job of communicating just the depths of the crisis and the way that this had brought Washington, D.C. to a standstill. The Eastern Argus wrote in an article about developments in D.C. as the Maine statehood question is getting debated. The Missouri question has at length commenced in the Senate, and it absorbs so much attention that until it is indefinitely settled, it may almost be said that no other business will be done in Congress. Never were the galleries and lobbies more crowded. So I love the sense it gives of just how intense and impassioned and the focus on Washington, D.C., and that nothing could get done until this gets resolved. And I do think that reminds me of our contemporary moment in a whole lot of ways with, recent debates about Supreme Court judges really commanding attention from all over the country, and obviously the national election as well. Any other question or comment about this sort of textbook map? At one of my very first talks like this, I had a person raise their hand who was quite cross and said, when I was taught about this, it was the Maine-Missouri Compromise, not the Missouri Compromise. I kind of chuckled, and yeah, you're right. We should include both states in that. And in fact, Maine's population was incredibly larger than the population of Missouri at the time. So really, the balance should be much more on the Maine side of the issue. But another thing about this map I came to feel was really misleading, and not just on a somewhat technical Maine pride sort of ground, but this question of calling it a compromise. And my sense that that was not an accurate label really comes from the language of members of the Maine delegation to the Congress who protested that as a way to describe the resolution of the conflict. So, as I mentioned before, Henry Clay had put together this complicated package of bills to try to break through the crisis that had led to the stalemate of national politics. And what is fascinating to me is that the strong majority of the Maine delegation to the US House of Representatives voted against Maine becoming a state if it were to do so by agreeing to the expansion of slavery in Missouri. So here's an amazing contrast between 1820 and 2020. In 1820, there were 7 US congressmen in the House of Representatives, right? We are very lucky to hold on to 2 in the next census. So Maine, even before it was a state, it's just part of Massachusetts, but it had enough population relative to the national population to merit 7 members of the House of Representatives. And the vote in the US Congress on this controversial issue passed by the narrowest of margins, just 90 to 87. And if the two members in the minority in the US, in the Maine delegation, had voted against the linkage with Missouri, it would have been enough to have that connection fail in the US Congress. So really a searing issue that came down to the closest possible of votes. And in some sense, those two pro-slavery Maine congressmen made the difference that allowed this resolution of the crisis to go forward. Now, what's interesting is when politicians have to take a stand on a controversial issue, they often have to explain it in public. And so we've got newspaper articles by politicians on both sides who justify and explain why they took the stand that they did on the issue. And so I learned a lot by reading the article that was written by 4 of the 5 US congressmen from Maine who voted against Maine statehood. And they explained the reason they did this because the expansion of slavery disturbed them so much that that was not a price they were willing to pay for Maine to become a state. So I'm going to quote from part of their joint newspaper letter. They discuss at some length that they were afraid of slave power, that they thought this would corrupt Republican government, and that this was, quote, abhorrent to their notions of the rights of man and humanity. And they went on to say, it is a falsehood to call this a compromise. We utterly protest against and refuse to sanction this with our approval. So, having read that letter, I've decided I no longer will call this the Maine-Missouri Compromise. That is to treat it as, I think, something different than the Maine politicians understood it to have been, which was a brutal and hard-fought political struggle that they lost, and that they were not reconciled with that outcome. They still found it morally abhorrent and something that they did not want to paper over with a word like compromise, as if some positive bargain had been made. Now, my closing thought about this, I'm happy to turn to questions too, is that what I think this reminds us of very forcefully is just how central slavery and the politics of Blackness is to US political culture. And it's clearly true in 1820, and it is clearly true in 2020. And in both time periods, it may be the case that Maine does not have a large population of people of African descent, but as part of US national culture and as participants in US history and society, that is a legacy that has power and importance that we need to grapple with, both in the statehood era, but also in contemporary Maine life. So if anyone can handle more on this, we could dig into it more, but I'm also happy to move on. And if anyone prefers to type a question, that's fine too. You can use the chat box.
Hi, I am curious about the Maine population, the ordinary citizens, and the ones who were not necessarily in the Congress voting for it. I would assume, maybe I shouldn't make this assumption, I'm thinking probably there are more people who agreed with those 5 who were opposed to this. is that more or less the case? I would guess.
Thanks for that question. It's really an important one and a challenging one. You know, we have a lot of evidence, or at least some evidence, about political leaders, and we can, you know, the issue is well covered in newspapers, so we can read them to try to understand popular opinion in the period. Newspapers then, much more so than today, were really strident partisan vehicles. So, you know, we have to think carefully about, you know, does this really reflect popular opinion? I do think that the majority opinion of those congressmen does broadly reflect popular opinion in Maine. But there is some conjecture involved in that, and that is a trickier question to answer than I wish it was.
I didn't know if there'd ever been any, well, and this would be pretty tedious, as well, research tends to be anyway, I suppose, but, and it's not like there are loads of journals, and even when you find journals, they don't necessarily come from the correct time period or discuss these particular things. But I didn't know if there had been maybe either journals or letters or other types of things like that, outside of newspapers. Because you're right, I remember hearing that at one point, I think there were basically 2 different newspapers in Portland, and each one covered a particular side, and it was like this, you know, bashing of heads there.
Yeah, and in fact, we're looking at the 2 partisan newspaper headlines right here, that the 5 who opposed published in the Portland Gazette, the 2 that were in favor published in the Eastern Argus, and very rarely do they publish opinions from the other side. You know, one of the interesting things, so the Maine Historical Society is, of course, the largest manuscript archive in the state of Maine, and they do have very rich papers of politicians from this era, but the 2 major collections they have are both by people who favored Maine statehood. So we actually know quite a bit more about people like Mark Langdon Hill and John Holmes. Those are the 2 Maine congressmen who vote in favor of Maine statehood and accept the expansion of slavery to Missouri. And they both are very partisan Democratic Republicans. That is part of their raison d'etre. And that is the party of Jefferson. That is a party of the South that is reconciling popular sovereignty with a pro-slavery stand in this period. And, you know, what's really interesting is the position of William King. So William King is the first governor of the state, and he is the leader of the Democratic Republican political party. And it's really letters to him are a lot of the material that's at the Maine Historical Society. What's fascinating is that William King's brother, Rufus King, was a leading Federalist member of the US Senate. Rufus King represented New York, and Rufus King was an anti-slavery leader. And his brother William, at first thought maybe he would follow his brother's lead and insist that Maine politicians who were Democratic Republicans like himself not support the connection to Missouri. But very quickly, William backs away from that. He sort of hears this advice he's getting from Mark Langdon Hill and John Holmes, and he decides it's going to be better for his partisan political interests to have a staunch Jeffersonian position on this issue. So there's turmoil and intrigue, and I'm hoping at one of these talks someday someone will say, you know, in my attic I've got some papers from my great-great-grandfather, and we'll have a neat trove of letters to try to flesh out this story more. But I do think it's a little lopsided. We know much more about the pro-statehood, pro-expansion of slavery Democratic Republican perspective on this issue than we do about the anti-slavery and Federalist side of it. All right, yeah, Diane. You have to unmute though.
There. I was also wondering, of the 7 that were in the House of Representatives, what the split was between those that were coastal versus those that were inland, because I thought there was another question about the coastal law and the impact of that on the expense of shipping along the coast.
Let's, I'm going to turn to that in my next discussion. So you or the person who typed it in could ask the question again if I don't quite cover it. So I'm going to move on to my second past-present connection. And that is to stay in the realm of sort of formal politics, but not so much on the national level, right? The Maine, Missouri crisis was a national issue. A lot of it is in DC. A lot of it is about Democratic, Republican political leadership at the national level. But maybe the most surprising thing about the Maine independence movement is that it took so long, right? From our perspective in 2020, it's a bit of a puzzler that people in Maine, when they had the chance, didn't right away cut their ties with Massachusetts. It actually takes 6 votes, the first one in 1792, the last one in 1819, before we really get a strong majority in Maine in favor of separating from Massachusetts. So that's a puzzle to us, I think, right? We would not expect that to be the case today. And it reminds us that sometimes our distant historical perspective can be misleading. We would assume that this would be automatic. My goodness, Maine and Massachusetts aren't even physically connected by land. How could this possibly last so long as a district of the state of Massachusetts? So one of the reasons that, there are all sorts of reasons why Maine state independence was actually a controversial and a worrisome question in the time it was being debated. And one of those reasons is because there was such a high degree of partisan anger. And we've already talked about partisan anger on the national level around the issue of slavery, but that is also the case within the District of Maine and between Maine and Massachusetts in this era. A lot of intense suspicions about one's political opponent. And so unfortunately, this too is one of the deep continuities between the statehood era and the present day. I think sometimes when we think back to the early republic, we can get very nostalgic and wear rose-tinted glasses and think about, that was an era when political leadership was really great and we didn't have the kind of terrible conflicts that we have today. And sadly, that is not true. There were such mean, petty, hostile political disagreements in this era that it really is kind of shocking. And they intertwine around the statehood movement in a whole lot of interesting and potentially complicated ways. So what I've got up on the screen now are color-coded county level voting information on the 6 statewide questions of should the district separate from Massachusetts or not. So in this map, purple are the areas in favor of Maine separation, and green are the areas opposed to separation. Now, I'm just going to make 3 general comments about interpreting all this color, and if anybody wants to ask a question, we can dig a little bit deeper. But one of the basic things to understand is that the partisan meaning of Maine independence changes over time, right? We're talking about a movement that lasts several decades. And so when Maine independence begins as a political movement in the 1780s, before a vote is even held, it is really led by conservative federalists in Falmouth, in modern day Portland. And they basically would like to become independent so that they could be the big shots in the independent state of Maine, right? These wealthy merchants in Falmouth, they were never going to be able to elbow their way in among the grandees of Boston. So Maine independence begins in the 1780s and 90s as a federalist movement in the state of Maine, but that's going to change over time. And by the latter three votes, it is strongly associated with the Democratic Republican Party, the party of Jefferson that first comes to national power in 1800. Now, what's interesting in looking at the colors on this map is that we see that the pro-separation vote doesn't grow a little bit at each moment, right? It's actually a very jagged story. And so 1807, only 24% of voters statewide favor independence, and only a single county, Kennebec County, had a majority in favor of independence. So that is the low moment of the Maine independence period. Now, on the other side of that is the War of 1812. And that is really a searing experience in the District of Maine. And that accelerates Maine people's feeling that they are not being supported by politicians in distant Boston. So the post-War of 1812 votes in 1816 and 1819, we begin to see much stronger pro-separation votes. And we do have this kind of bizarre thing of two statewide votes in the year of 1816. So in May of 1816, there is a strong majority in favor of separation, but the turnout is so low that the Massachusetts legislature says, you know, you better do it again. We got to make sure, because not enough people even bothered to vote in May of 1816. Both sides mobilize like crazy. The number of voters goes way, way up in the second 1816 vote. But the margin for the pro-separation vote drops below the limit that was set by the Massachusetts legislature. So in 1816, with a low turnout in May, I think 64% of voters are in favor of separation. But when turnout grows like crazy, that vote drops to 54%. And the Maine legislature had said it's got to be 56% or higher in order to pass. So this remains at sort of a loggerheads until we get to the vote in 1819. And in some ways, this is the most boring because there's such a strong majority in favor of separation in that final July of 1819 vote. And one of the reasons it had become such a slam dunk by then ties back to the question Diane asked earlier about the federal coasting law. So one of the powerful arguments against Maine separation was a federal law that allowed a ship not to enter customs if it sailed to a state with which it was adjacent. And given the funny geography of Massachusetts, as long as Maine was part of Massachusetts, you could sail from Eastport all the way to New Jersey before you would have to enter customs. So for anybody who was a merchant, anyone who was tied to shipping and commerce, there was a real worry that Maine independence would be a huge burden on commercial and shipping interests if the District of Maine became independent. Now, there are some other really potent divisions in Maine politics in this time. And a lot of it does have to do with a divide between people on the coast and interior settlers. So obviously coastal settlements are more tied to maritime trade. So they've got that as a powerful reason for staying part of Massachusetts, especially while that federal coasting law is in effect. There's also an economic difference. There is more wealth and affluence on the coast, and more new settlers have moved to the interior of Maine. So there's an economic divide, and that, of course, is something that resonates with us today. We are familiar with thinking about differences in affluence based on where you live in Maine. This divide also has a really significant religious component. And the older settlements on the coast are much more strongly Congregationalist, and the newer interior settlements are much more strongly Methodist and Baptist. And that is significant politically because Massachusetts has a state tax supported official church into the 1830s. Right? This is a legacy of the Puritan origins of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So the Constitution has outlawed an establishment of a national church, but the Constitution does not apply to state governments. So the state of Massachusetts requires your taxes to support a settled minister in your community. And until that law is finally changed in 1834, that overwhelmingly favored congregational ministers. So this is really explosive. There's a partisan divide between Federalists and Democratic Republicans. There's a geographic divide. There's a divide of economic status. There's a divide of religion. And to the extent that those line up in a total polarizing sense, we've got a really dangerous political situation in Maine in the early republic. And some of the most intense conflict occurs between Lincoln and Kennebec counties in that mid-coast region, with a lot of dispute over access to land and ownership of land. And this is interlinked with the Maine political separation question in many, many different ways. So I'm just going to stop there. If anyone wants to ask more about it, I'm happy to chat about it. But I think we've covered a lot of the key ground there. All right, I'm going to move on and share my favorite map by Moses Greenleaf. And part of what I love about the map I'm going to show you next is that it reminds us of how misleading the maps are that we're looking at right now. Right? Those maps project voters in those counties living everywhere in those spaces. But that is very far from the case. So Moses Greenleaf makes this map in 1829 that is just packed with fascinating information. It's got population data on it, tax data on it. It traces the center of the population center of the state as it moved over time. And what it does most boldly with those three bands of color is to depict where English-speaking settlers lived in the District of Maine over time. So the blue areas are the parts of Maine that were settled by English speakers at the time of the American Revolution. The pink or red area are the areas where English speakers had expanded to by the election of Jefferson in 1800. And the yellow areas are the parts of Maine that were settled by English speakers by statehood in 1820. These are the only parts of the District of Maine where people, adult white men, are voting on the question of Maine separation. Now, I'm going to move from that map to take a look at a close-up of the Dover, Foxcroft, and Sangerville area. Right, so this is basically, so there's, I know this is probably very small on some of your screens. Dover is identified here on the map, Foxcroft up above it. So we've got sort of a band of Sangerville, Dover, Atkinson, and a band of Guilford, Foxcroft, Sebec. And here's Williamsburg, or Williamsboro, where Moses Greenleaf, in fact, was from, the cartographer who made this map, right? And I think he made this map in part because of where he lived. And he knew that it did matter, your perspective about the state and where you lived. Now, I do have some extremely detailed town level voting data about the stand that voters took in this region of Maine on the statehood question. All of it in relatively newly formed Penobscot County. Piscataquis County is a distant figment of people's imagination at this point. And the largest vote, like the town with the largest number of voters, is Dexter. So Dexter has 2 recorded votes on the separation issue, one in September of 1816, no recorded votes in May, that low turnout election, and a second recorded vote in July of 1819. And they give unanimous votes on both occasions in favor of Maine independence, right? So that makes sense. We would expect, I mean, this sort of fits that geographic explanation of the vote, that people from, oh, do I have, is Dexter on this map? I'm gonna embarrass myself. Where is it?
Yes, it's just south of Sangerville, Liam.
Thank you.
On the map.
Keener eyes than mine. There we go, right there, Dexter. So Dexter residents, the voting residents, voted 27-0 and then 58-0 in favor of Maine independence. And again, that's the town with the largest number of votes. The Sebec voters are the second largest number of voters in July of 1819. They also are overwhelmingly in favor of independence, 48-2. Again, kind of what we'd expect. Poorer interior regions, fewer Congregationalists, more Democratic Republicans. That's what we anticipate. But there are a couple of wrinkles that are curious. And this is what I would really love a local historical society person to explain to me. So the town of Williamsboro, where Moses Greenleaf lived, did not support Maine independence. And in fact, in that town, the vote was, now it's not on my page, I think the vote there is 2 in favor of independence and 11 against. And in Atkinson, here on the map, the vote was 8 in favor and 18 against. And in Sangerville, we've got a really narrowly contested question where 19 voters were in favor of independence and 16 were opposed to it. Now, this is in a context of a statewide election in July of 1819 with 72% of voters in the state in favor of Maine independence. But we've got several communities in the Dover, Foxcross, Sangerville region that have divided or even opposed votes to independence. And that, to me, is a fascinating puzzle, right? Part of what is terrific about this kind of nitty-gritty local political history is that it reminds us that those big raw numbers often overshadow variation at the local level. And so this is where I await the person from the East Sangerville Grange who will say, oh, I have a diary by my great-great-great-grandfather, and he wanted to stay part of Maine, and he wrote about it, or a letter collection, or even, I just don't know enough about what made Atkinson, Sangerville, Williamsburg, places like this vote in favor of staying part of Maine. I actually do have an opinion about why Williamsburg votes the way it does. I found it on my list here. So only 15 voters there, 2 in favor of independence, 13 against. So Moses Greenleaf is a conservative federalist and Congregationalist, and he undoubtedly was the leading citizen of the town of Williamsboro in 1819. So I am sure it is his conservative convictions that is leading that community to take the strong anti-independence stand that it does. And I would suspect there's probably someone similar in Atkinson, and maybe 2 families who disagree with one another in Sangerville who would help us to explain why they take the sort of stand that they do. If anybody wants to throw out something about the local history of the region, I would love to hear it. All right, I am going to move very quickly through my last 2 points of connection and then turn to any general questions that people may have. I do think that a focus on partisan anger can lead us, both in 1820 and in 2020, to overstate the polarization of Maine and US society. And one of the reasons I say this is that just looking at formal politics and the votes in politics does not begin to tell the full story of early American history. So one of the crucial things that is excluded if we're only looking at voters who live in this particular region of Maine is that we are flattening our sense of Maine history and excluding a really important community on the St. John River. And this connects to, again, one of the misleading aspects of many of those earlier Maine maps that we were looking at, where we sort of imagine this fixed international border far to the north. But that was never settled in the statehood era. It will not be, as most Mainers know, until the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842 that there is any clarity brought to where the northern boundary of Maine exists. And a lot of this, well, almost all of it arises from the mess that the diplomats made at the end of the American Revolution, when they negotiated the Treaty of Paris in 1783, and they used a copy of the Mitchell map to define where the border should be. And the crazy lines that we see on this map are the differences of opinion among those diplomats in Paris in 1783 who were imagining where the end of the United States should be and where the start of British North America should be, the loyal provinces of Quebec and Nova Scotia and later New Brunswick. So there's language in the treaty that states where the line will run, but the meaning of those words physically on the ground were incomprehensible. Nobody knew. And they gradually are sorting this out, starting with, they don't even know what river they agreed to, right? The St. Croix River could refer to any French river where the French had put a cross to claim that as a possession of France. So there's several St. Croix rivers going into Passamaquoddy Bay. So they kind of work their way in from the coast to resolve this, and don't do so until 1842. Now, this led me to take a look at the 1820 census for Penobscot County. I'm kind of curious, in the county I live, what are the big towns in 1820 and what does it look like? And again, Penobscot County is pretty much brand new. I think it was formed in 1816, so just a couple of years before statehood. And so in the printed US Census for 1820, it lists all the towns in Penobscot County as established by the Constitution. The largest town in 1820 was Hamden, 1,400 people. The second largest town was Bangor, 1,200 people. The third largest town in Penobscot County in 1820 was Madawaska, with a population of 1,100. And then in the printed US Census, there's a little asterisk. And you go down to the bottom of the page, and the census explains something about Madawaska. So I'm going to read part of this footnote in the census. The French settlement near Canada, about 200 miles from any town in Maine, from which there is no way to Madawaska. Now, there is a great Maine phrase, right? You cannot get there from here, right? They said that in the 1820 census about Madawaska. The only way to get there is via New Brunswick, quote, in a way very circuitous up the river St. John. The French have supposed they were in Canada. It is probable the county line, when run, will divide Madawaska between Penobscot and Washington counties. So this census taker was something of an imperialist, right? He is trying to push the boundaries of the US further east than they would be when the Webster-Ashburton Treaty settles this matter in 1842. And that treaty divided the community of Madawaska between the two banks of the St. John River. Now, that issue is one that remains potent and powerfully felt in the St. John River Valley today. The sense of isolation from the rest of Maine, the sense that concerns of St. John Valley residents are not part of the politics of the state of Maine that center in Augusta and places like Portland. And that sense of isolation and distance has been heightened in recent years, in recent months, because of the closure of the international border due to the coronavirus pandemic. So I learned a lot when I went and gave a Maine statehood talk in Madawaska, that they look at the Maine statehood era really differently than most English speakers in the state of Maine, both in 1820 and in 2020. And several of the very nice people who hosted me at my talk at Madawaska High School had the same funny comment. They thanked me for coming all the way from Bangor in southern Maine to give the talk. Of course, most people in Bangor do not think they live in southern Maine. And they also appreciated that I had to drive uphill the whole way to get there. It was so much harder for people from southern Maine to get to Madawaska, and that's why they usually travel downhill to visit us. So there was bitter partisan division. There were coastal interior divides among English speakers, but the world of Maine in 1820 and 2020 was more diverse and more interesting and richer than simply squeezing everything into a sort of polarized us, them, red, blue sort of way of thinking of the world. So I want to end with a fourth really important issue that was very much alive in the statehood era and that is still widely recognizable in contemporary life in Maine. And that is to ask the question, what did Maine statehood mean for Wabanaki sovereignty? So Maine is being created as a sovereign government entity with its own special kind of authority in the federalist governmental structure of the United States. But as this map shows us so nicely, the Wabanaki homeland stretches across this region, across multiple states, across multiple provinces, and across what was an uncertain but then a clear international border between the US and Canada. And Wabanaki tribes had entered into diplomatic relations with Massachusetts since the 17th century and had done so in the late 18th century and had done so in the early 19th century. So what would happen with those treaties that the Penobscot and Passamaquoddy in particular had entered into with Massachusetts if now Maine was the colonial sovereign entity that claimed a presence in their traditional homeland? Now, there is a great deal to be said about this very important question. And I just want to summarize it briefly by suggesting the importance of maintaining two ways of answering this question, two dimensions to it. And the first of these is to very squarely face the incredible perils that Maine statehood brought for Wabanaki individuals and communities and nations. And Maine statehood accelerates the dispossession of Wabanaki people from their traditional homelands and also coincides with a continuing population decline for Wabanaki people that is tremendous. And those decadal censuses that show a booming population for English speakers in Maine that gave us 7 US House of Representative members in 1820, those just as starkly are threats to Wabanaki people throughout this region. Now, those perils and challenges to Wabanaki people can hardly be overstated. However, it is also crucial to recognize the persistence, not just of Wabanaki individuals and communities, but of Wabanaki tribal governments as well. And this is true from the very earliest moments of statehood and is a fixture of Maine government from its very earliest years. So the Maine legislature has a Penobscot tribal delegate at the legislature starting in 1823, practically from the very first meeting of the Maine state legislature. And the Passamaquoddy will add a tribal representative in 1842. And the Holton Band of the Maliseet will add a tribal representative to the Maine state legislature in 2010. Now, these tribal delegates are not voting members. I am not suggesting this is a ideal, equal sort of world, but it does demonstrate the tenacity, the presence, the engagement of Wabanaki people with the new government of the state of Maine. And that persistence is a fundamentally important aspect of Maine history to recognize. And it challenges what I do think is the fundamental myth of colonization, and that is that Indians will eventually disappear. That was a deeply ingrained aspect of colonial society in the 17th century, in the 18th century, in the 19th century, and indeed into the present. And it is gravely in error. The national population of indigenous people in the US has been growing every year since about 1910. And so issues related to Wabanaki sovereignty are going to be more important for my children and their children than they were for me or my grandparents. That this is not an issue in the distant past of early American history, but it is one of the ways that 1820, and 2020 remain connected in a profound way. And recognizing the presence of Wabanaki people and nations as willful actors in the state era is one important way we can better understand contemporary white Indian relations in 21st century Maine. So with that, I am going to take a sip of water. I have really enjoyed coming and speaking with you. I suspect I have worn out your great patience with this long talk, but I am very happy to take questions by voice or through the chat. So thank you all for coming tonight. Appreciate it.
And feel free to unmute yourselves to give Liam a round of applause too. Thank you so much, Liam. Does anyone have a question here at the end?
I just have a comment, Liam.
Yeah.
If I could. Two things. One, you were talking about why people in a town sort of near Dover might sort of vote in favor of continuing with Massachusetts statehood.
Yeah.
I always think about family ties, and my family settled Maine not that long after the Revolution, and kept their ties to Massachusetts very closely, you know. And there were family, like they could just sail directly south and be in Marshfield from, down east on the sailing routes. And there was still a lot of trade and family ties happening that way, was one thought. And the other one is that when my family did settle here on the St. Croix and Chepetnicook Lakes, they didn't recognize the border.
Yeah.
And I can't go to my family graveyard right now because the border is closed. And we had all these ties to New Brunswick, but subsequently, after World War II, and then as the border sort of tightened up, those ties in like cousins and different generations degenerated. And now it's sort of divided. It's interesting, and we don't have those ties anymore. They used to have these huge, family reunions and stuff in the, East Grand or wherever, like Spednick Lake, and now that that doesn't happen anymore.
So Keith, I really appreciate those comments, and you're absolutely right. The family history is so important to individuals' sense of the past, and it's a really helpful way of thinking about this era. And it does remind us of how difficult it would have been to separate from Massachusetts for people who themselves had quite possibly been born there and had migrated to Maine as these questions were coming to the fore. And there are all sorts of personal connections that would have made that a very difficult decision. So there's no question about it. And in a similar way across the international border, as you were saying. And I do think Maine has a great deal to gain still from doing a better job of placing ourselves not at the furthest edge of the United States, but actually in the center of a transnational region that includes all sorts of rich connections to Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, and beyond, right? And just in terms of marketing and thinking about tourism in the future of our state, if it's, drive to Acadia and then do a U-turn, we're doomed, right? It's got to be to there and then beyond as we integrate more fully. So, and
Well, we could be in that time zone for sure.
Could be in that time zone. We'd have better light.
That's right.
But in the wake of 9/11 and now in the wake of the pandemic, that opportunity for stronger international connections has really suffered a blow that we're going to have to work on in the decade coming forward to reestablish and strengthen.
Well, if there are no more questions, then thank you all so much for coming. Diane, thank you and the Grange for being part of this.
Very happy. Thank you, Liam, very much.
It was my pleasure. Thank you all for coming and being such a nice audience. I appreciate it.
And I did forget to mention at the beginning, and I started late, but we did record this. So contact me if you'd like the link, if you'd like to watch this again or share it with anybody.
Thanks, Greta and Diane, particularly.
Thank you, Liam.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you.